G'day Blender heads and Pokemaniacs! Earlier this year, after 20 long years, we received the long anticipated successor to the game, Pokemon Snap. The original Pokemon Snap was only available on the Nintendo 64, which broke my little 12-year-old heart, because the only way I could play it was via emulators, which always crashed after the first level. But I now have a Nintendo Switch, and I've thoroughly been enjoying seeing 3D Pokemon wandering around their natural environments. So, to celebrate the release of this much anticipated game, we're going to be building our own version of the Neo 1 vehicle, and then you'll be able to make Pokemon safaris of your own. For all you Pokemaniacs who may have stumbled upon this video, we'll be using the 3D modelling software called Blender for this tutorial. Blender is a free 3D program which you can use to create, well, pretty much anything you want. And when I say free, I really mean it's free. There's no 30-day trials or freeware nonsense here. Blender's development is fully funded by the community, so you can download your own copy right now and get started making 3D art. There will be a download link in the description below. The Neo 1 is, relatively speaking, made up of a bunch of very simple shapes, which is actually pretty standard for Pokemon designs. Most of the Pokemon themselves can be broken down into simple shapes and silhouettes, and the Neo 1 is no exception. So before I begin modelling something like this, I often like to break it down into those simple shapes first, as it helps me think about how best to make all the various parts. You can see here all the major shapes broken down into their simplest forms. The base is just a sphere cut in half. The top ring is a torus or donut shape. The little fin out the back is a bit of an interesting shape, but I'll be showing you later how it's actually just another sphere. The side engines are cylinders with rounded edges. The bumper bar at the front is a cylinder with a couple of kinks in it, which I'll show you how to make with a simple curve. The lights and the back engines are just more cylinders, and these internal seats are mostly just cubes of varying sizes with beveled edges. So with these simple shapes in mind, let's jump into Blender and start modelling. Usually when you model in 3D, it's a great idea to have a front and side sketch of your object to use as reference. Now unfortunately with the way that the game is designed, it's been very difficult to find good front and side images of the Neo 1. I did manage to find this one front shot, which is far from perfect, but we'll use it to help create this white outer shell shape. Instead, I'm going to show you a slightly different technique for using reference images. For this tutorial, we're going to be modelling from a perspective view. By the way, I'm using PureRef here, which is just brilliant for collecting reference images. Like Blender, it's also free, and there'll be a link in the description to download it. Now, although this is a beginner's tutorial, it's not aimed at absolute beginners. You'll need to be familiar with some of Blender's keyboard shortcuts. To learn those, I'm going to recommend jumping over to the Blender Guru channel and tackling the donut tutorial, where Andrew covers a lot of the basics like moving around the 3D space. But I won't be leaving you completely in the dark. For any new users out there, take note of this little gizmo down here. It shows you what buttons I'm pushing. If you're not familiar with the keyboard shortcuts yet, this is where you can start learning them. First off, we need to create a camera. For now, just loosely place your camera from the same perspective as the reference image. In fact, let's add a floor so we've got a better idea of where in the world we are. Next, we'll drag that reference image into Blender and onto our camera view. This attaches the image to our camera, so no matter where we move our camera, the image stays connected. You'll want to adjust a few settings so that you can see things a bit better. Go to the camera settings and go down to background image. You can enable and disable your image by clicking this checkbox. Firstly, change the depth option from back to front. This makes it so that our image will always be in front of our geometry. You can also adjust the opacity to your liking. Finally, hit fit so the image is no longer stretched. We now have our reference image set up. To help us align our reference image, you'll want to start creating objects. So again, go to the creation menu and this time choose a UV sphere. You'll notice the UV sphere appears halfway through the floor plane that we created before. To fix this, select the sphere and press G for grab, Z to snap it to the up and down axes, and finally 1 to move it 1 meter upwards. This puts the sphere perfectly on the ground. We can then right click and go to Set Origin, Origin to 3D Cursor. This will snap our pivot point to the base of the sphere so that when we scale it, it will scale from the ground upwards. Scale the sphere until it roughly matches the size of the white half sphere on your reference image. You may need to adjust your camera to match. Don't get too caught up in making this absolutely perfect. It becomes easier the more objects you create. Next, let's create the yellow engines on the side, as these are really helpful for lining up the camera. I'll create a cylinder this time, making sure I set its vertices to 20. This will be important later when we add these little ridges in there. Again, the cylinder will be in the ground slightly, so bring it up using G, Z, and 1. Then do your best to move and rotate it into position. I found using this ring on the engines is really helpful for lining these up. Once you think you've got it close, add a mirror modifier to create the engine on the other side in the perfect position. You'll notice that the mirror modifier doesn't work immediately. Since we'll be mirroring a lot of objects in this tutorial, let's create a permanent mirror point for this and all of our future objects. Go back into your creation menu and create an empty. It doesn't really matter which type. Let's rename it mirror so we don't lose it. Now go back to your mirror modifier and choose the mirror object. Your engine should immediately mirror correctly. But oh no, our mirror doesn't match up with our reference image very well at all. Don't worry, this is very normal for this method. Lining up your camera can take some time, but the more objects you have, the easier it becomes. You might also need to change your camera's focal length to match the reference. Like I say, this can take some time to perfect and I encourage you to practice it. However, for the purposes of moving this tutorial along and giving you something accurate to work with, you can use these camera settings. Set the camera position to 45, negative 46.7, and 27.5. For the rotation, set it to 70.5, negative 0.5, and 44.6. You'll also want to set the camera's focal length to 75. With your new camera position, you may find that you need to adjust your objects to match. Keep in mind this doesn't need to be absolutely perfect, you just want it as close as possible. With the camera in place now, I don't want to accidentally move it, so I'm going to go to View and uncheck Camera to View. Now if we try and shift the camera, we actually jump out of camera view and our camera stays in place. You can always jump back to our camera view by selecting it from the Q menu. I'm also going to select our camera and lock all of its transforms, as we can still accidentally move it by selecting it. To make moving around our scene easier, I'm going to split our view into two. Now I can zoom around our 3D scene while still being able to see our reference in the other window. With all of that set up, we can now get back to modelling the Neo 1. Select the sphere and go into edit mode by hitting Tab. From here I'll select a ring of edges by holding down Shift Alt and clicking. We want to select this ring of edges that line up with the top of the white shell. Then press Alt M to bring up the split menu and select Faces by Edges. This breaks your model along the edge, and then by pressing L you can now select the top half and simply delete it. That'll do for our sphere now. We'll come back later and chop it into pieces like it is in our reference. For now, let's turn our attention back to some of these basic shapes. Let's do this ring shape at the top next. Create a torus. We'll want this torus shape to be very simple, so drop its minor segments to 3 to create this kind of pyramid shape. I'll also lower the major segments to around 12. Bring the torus up and scale it to roughly fit the reference image. Don't be afraid to go into edit mode to make it match a little bit closer. Once you have it fairly close, select all the edges and bevel them with Ctrl B. Scroll your mouse wheel to add some additional segments. In my case, I'm using 3. From here, you can add a subdivision modifier. Remember that you can use Ctrl 1 or Ctrl 2 to quickly add this modifier. And finally, don't forget to right-click and select Smooth Shade. Now we need to add this little loop at the back. Duplicate the sphere at the bottom. As you can see, if we rotate this, it still rotates from the bottom, which isn't what we want. We want to be able to rotate from the center. Fortunately, this ring part is in the center, so we can use its pivot point. Select the ring and press Shift S. This brings up a whole bunch of pivot point options. We want this one down the bottom called Cursor to Selected. This snaps our 3D cursor to the ring. We can now select the sphere again and use the full stop shortcut and change our transform locator to the 3D cursor. Now we can rotate it around until it lines up with the loop. It should be around about 45 degrees. You'll probably need to scale it up a bit as it needs to align with the outside edge of the donut, and the sphere here currently aligns with the inner ring. We can now go into edit mode, select the faces we want to keep, press Ctrl I to invert our selection and delete the unneeded faces. Our faces are a little thick here, so I'm going to insert some additional edge loops, Then select these outer faces and delete them too. We now have our bridge in place, but we need to connect it to the donut shape. If we turn on our wireframe under the viewport overlays and disable the subdivision modifier on our donut, you can see that we don't really have enough geometry to connect the two shapes easily. So we're going to need to set the subdivisions to level 1 and apply the modifier. We can now join these two objects by pressing Ctrl J. I'm also going to make our lives a little easier and add a mirror modifier, so let's delete half of the object and add the modifier. You can see that this bridge section connects to the donut across these three faces. I'm going to zoom in and select a few of these faces, starting just on the inside of our bevel. I'm then going to delete all of those faces. Our bridge section doesn't currently have any thickness to it, so let's select those faces by pressing L and extrude them back slightly. You'll notice that the center faces in the middle here pull away slightly. It also creates this unnecessary face between the two, so delete that extra face, make sure that you've got clipping set in your mirror modifier and drag those edges back to the middle. Now let's delete these outer faces so that we have a hole going through the middle. We now want to bridge these edges to the ones back on our donut, but our donut clearly has a lot more edges and the bridge will be very messy. Instead, we'll want to add those additional edges to our bridge section so that they join up better. Go back to your viewport overlays and turn on statistics. This will give you a little overlay telling you all the details about your object, including how many edges you have selected. As you can see, we only have 4 on the bridge but 16 on the donut. We need to get our bridge piece to have 16 edges as well. To do this, I'm first going to bevel its edges using 2 segments. That gets our edge count up to 12. I'm then going to add some extra edge loops along all the sides, taking us to a total of 16. We can now comfortably bridge the two and keep clean geometry. I'm going to add another edge loop between them so that I can move these vertices around better to match our reference. That takes care of our ring for now, so let's turn our attention to the lights. These are a lot more simple. Let's start by adding another cylinder. I know I'm going to be using the subdivision modifier with my lights, so I'm going to drop the vertex count to 8, which is about as low as you can go while still retaining a good circular shape. Rotate and move the cylinder roughly in place. Then go into edit mode and let's scale the back end up a little bit so we get a tapering effect. I'm then going to go to the front faces and inset it slightly to create a lip, and I'm going to delete that face. The glass here is mostly a sphere shape, so let's select these edges and move our 3D cursor. Now when we create the sphere, it's in the exact place we need it. I want the sphere to match up to the cylinder, so I'm going to change both its segments to 8 and rotate the sphere 90 degrees on the x-axis. I'll then scale it up until it roughly matches the edges of our cylinder. I'll also scale it down on the y-axis to better match our reference. I'm then going to split this sphere in half, so let's go into edit mode, select the center edge and hit Alt-M to split the faces. You can then select half of your object using L and press P and choose separate by selection. We now have 2 halves of a sphere. Let's hide the outer sphere so we can see better and join the cylinder to the other half of the sphere. Select the outer edges of both objects and merge by distance. You may need to raise your distance setting just to make sure that they join properly. Add some edge loops to help hold the shape of the light, and then add a subdivision modifier. You'll see we're getting some really strange results, and if we smooth shade the model, it only gets worse. This is because our normals are reversed. A quick tip to be able to see your normals, go to the overlay options again and choose face orientation. You'll see that most of our objects are blue, but the inner part of the sphere is red. This is telling us that our normals are reversed, and that's what's causing our issue here. Go into edit mode and select everything, and bring up the normals menu by pressing Alt-N, and choose recalculate outside. This will flip those red normals and make sure the subdivision modifier behaves as expected. You can now go back and disable the face orientation overlay.
You'll probably have noticed that the ring is poking through the light a little. Let's fix this by going to our ring, going into edit mode, and adding an extra edge loop. You can now delete the unneeded faces.
You'll see in the reference we have this little black ring around the glass. In reality, this would be a piece of rubber to hold everything in place and make sure that the glass doesn't get scratched. So let's add this. Go into edit mode on your light and select the outer ring of faces. Press Shift D to duplicate them and then right click so that they don't move. Then press P and separate them into a new object. Finally, add a solidify modifier and give it some thickness and apply it. Unhide the glass and make sure that all the objects line up properly. And then going to select the glass, the rubber, and the light base and join them all into one object. Now I can duplicate the light and make little side lights. Add a mirror modifier to make the other light and place them to line up with our reference. Don't forget to go into edit mode and tweak the back ends of the light just a little bit. To create this black bumper bar, we'll use a curve. Go to your creation menu and choose Curve Bezier. Now go into the edit mode of the curve, select all the points and press V and choose Vector. This forces the curve to go straight. Move the vertices around and extrude where necessary to create the bumper bar shape. Make sure to look at your reference from multiple angles because this shape can be a little tricky. For example, this last extrusion actually needs to go up slightly, which is difficult to see from this one perspective. Add a mirror modifier so we can see our bumper on both sides. You'll likely need to adjust it further to match. Then go to your curve settings and add a bevel. I'm going to set mine to 0.5. To add this curvature, select all of your vertices and press the V key again. This time choose Aligned. Go to each of your vertices and adjust the shape of the Bezier curves.
Personally, I like to reduce the resolution of the curve and add a subdivision modifier. This just makes it easier to adjust later and it helps keep your scene lower poly.
Finally, let's go back to our engine turbines and add some extra details. Extrude and scale the front face until it matches up to your reference. Inset the face slightly to create a lip, and then extrude it backwards to match up to the blue lights. Inset this face a couple of times and then merge the last face. Bevel any necessary edges. Add an extra edge loop and scale it slightly to add a bulge to the nose area. There's also a slight indent where the nose of the engine connects to the body. To create this, we're going to separate the two meshes. Select the edge loop and use Alt-M to split the mesh. Then use P and separate by loose parts. Go to the new nose piece and extrude the last edge inwards slightly. Bevel that edge so that it holds its shape when we add the subdivision modifier. Now we can turn our attention to the back end. Add an extra edge loop near the front and scale it up slightly to get this tapering effect. Also extrude the front inwards a couple of times and then merge these vertices to the center. And again, bevel that edge ever so slightly. If we look at the turbines from behind, we can see that they have these internal workings, as well as this arm that connects back to the main body. For this arm to connect, we're going to need to cut away part of this yellow outer shell. Add an extra edge loop around the middle of our turbine, and then remove the faces we don't want. Add a solidify modifier, give it a little bit of thickness, and then apply it. As a final touch, we'll add these little ridge details. Add an extra edge loop at the back and then select the faces that line up to the ridges. Inset them slightly and then use the extrude along normals and extrude them in slightly, making sure not to penetrate through the inner layer. Adding a subdivision modifier now distorts those ridges, so let's add some extra edge loops to help hold their shape. And finally, create a new cylinder to add the inside of the engines. Most of the time we won't see this little extra detail, so I'm just going to add some extrudes and bevels just to give it a little bit of shape. And that will do us for this lesson. In the next lesson we'll start adding some additional details like cutting up the white shell and creating the transparent dome. I'll see you in the next one.